He simply bought an old house from an elderly woman, expecting nothing unusual. But when he started removing the old wallpaper, he discovered something hidden behind the wall for decades, and that discovery changed his life forever. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The first time Marcus imagined the wall, he did not yet know it existed. In that imagined future, he stood alone in the living room, the house silent around him, the afternoon light cutting through dust he had stirred up himself. Wet strips of old wallpaper hung from the walls like discarded skins, heavy with decades of glue and time. His arms ached, his shirt clung damply to his back, and the air smelled of plaster and something older, something paper dry and metallic. In the center of the room, where the wall should have been flat and ordinary, there was instead a faint rectangular outline, as precise as a frame that had been erased too carefully. He pressed his knuckles against it, and the sound that came back was wrong. Hollow. Waiting. That image flickered through his mind and vanished, leaving only the present. A bus rattling down a gray city street, the hum of traffic, and his reflection in the dark window glass, tired eyes framed by a face that had learned, over the years, how to stay composed even when nothing felt stable. Marcus was 34 years old and had spent most of his adult life helping other people rebuild what had been broken. As a social worker, he moved through systems designed to grind people down, guiding them through paperwork, court dates, housing programs, rehabilitation plans. He knew how fragile stability could be, how easily it slipped through fingers that had never been taught how to hold it. He also knew what it felt like to live without it. For years, his life had been a sequence of temporary spaces. Apartments rented on short leases, rooms that never quite felt his, walls he could not paint, floors he would never fix. Each place carried the faint sense of impermanence, as if he were always preparing to leave rather than settling in. Boxes remained half unpacked. Furniture was chosen for ease of transport, not comfort. Even rest felt provisional. Owning a house had become more than a practical goal. It was a quiet obsession, a marker that said he had crossed some invisible threshold, that his life had finally acquired weight and rootedness. He wanted a place that would not disappear beneath him if a landlord changed their mind or rent increase arrived in the mail. He wanted walls that would hold his life instead of merely containing it. The market, however, did not care about his reasons. Every listing he clicked through felt like a lesson in disappointment. Houses that looked promising vanished within hours, sold for tens of thousands above asking price. Others revealed their flaws only after closer inspection. Cracked foundations hidden behind fresh paint. Neighborhoods that felt wrong in ways statistics did not capture. Prices that climbed faster than his savings ever could. He learned to read between the lines of descriptions, to decode photographs that were carefully angled to hide the truth. Good houses, he came to believe, either did not exist or were never meant for people like him. That belief was already firmly in place when he found the listing. It appeared late one evening, buried between renovated flips and overpriced fixer-uppers. The photographs were unremarkable, almost deliberately plain. A modest two-story house with a small porch, pale siding, a narrow strip of lawn, bordered by old trees. The interior shots showed rooms that looked dated but intact. No dramatic lighting, no staged furniture, no exaggerated claims. The description was brief, almost indifferent, ending with a phrase that caught his attention more than any boast ever could. Priced to sell. As is. The number beneath it made him sit up straighter. It was low. Not impossibly low, not the kind of price that screamed scam or disaster, but low enough to feel out of place. In that neighborhood, with those square feet, it should have been higher, significantly higher. Marcus read the listing again, slower this time, searching for the catch. Structural damage, flood zone, legal complications. None were mentioned. The house had been owned by the same person for decades, according to the public record. No recent renovations, no known issues. The rational part of him immediately cataloged explanations. An estate sale, deferred maintenance, a seller who needed to move quickly. There were always reasons. And yet, beneath those explanations, a quieter thought took shape. If this house was so affordable, why hadn't someone else already taken it? The next morning, he drove to the address before the scheduled viewing, wanting to see the place without the filter of a real estate agent's optimism. The neighborhood greeted him with a stillness that felt preserved rather than abandoned. Houses stood close together, each with its own small variations, but all sharing a sense of age and continuity. Front porches bore the marks of long use. Mailboxes were old but maintained. Lawns were trimmed, though not obsessively. It was the kind of street where time moved differently, where change arrived slowly and often reluctantly. As Marcus parked and stepped out of his car, he became aware of how visible he was. Not unwelcome, not threatened, but noticed. A curtain shifted in an upstairs window across the street. Somewhere, a door closed softly. The neighborhood seemed to register his presence the way a body registers a change in air pressure. He walked past the house first, then circled back, giving himself a space to absorb it. The structure itself felt solid. The porch steps were worn, but steady. The roof sagged slightly with age, but showed no obvious signs of failure. The windows were old, but intact. Nothing screamed neglect. If there was something wrong with this house, it was not shouting. Marcus stood on the sidewalk and tried to imagine himself here months from now, keys in his pocket, groceries in his hands. The image felt possible, unusually so. That alone unsettled him. When the seller arrived, she did not fit the image he had unconsciously prepared. Evelyn was small, her posture slightly stooped, her movements careful and measured. Her hair was neatly arranged, her clothes plain but clean, chosen for function rather than impression. She greeted him with politeness that felt rehearsed, as though she had practiced the interaction in advance. Her eyes flicked briefly to his face, then away, settling instead on the house behind them. As she unlocked the door, Marcus noticed her hand tremble just enough to catch his attention. Inside, the house smelled like old fabric and dust warmed by sunlight. It was not unpleasant, just unmistakably aged. The rooms were quiet, absorbing sound rather than reflecting it, and the floors creaked in places where thousands of footsteps had passed before his. Light filtered through thin curtains, softening edges and blurring corners. Evelyn moved through the house quickly, almost urgently, pointing out features with minimal elaboration. She described the structure as strong, the layout as practical. When Marcus paused to look more closely at something, she waited with attention that seemed out of proportion to the moment. The living room was larger than he had expected, with high ceilings and a sense of openness that surprised him. One wall in particular drew his eye, not because it was remarkable, but because it was empty. No pictures, no shelves, no furniture pressed against it. It was covered in old wallpaper, beige with a faint vertical pattern that had faded unevenly over time. The surface looked smooth, carefully maintained despite its age. As Marcus took it in, he felt Evelyn's attention sharpen. She repeated, more than once, that the house was good as it was. that it did not need changes, that it had lasted this long without interference. Her voice carried a note that was not quite pleading, but close enough to make him uncomfortable. When he mentioned, casually, that he would likely repaint and update things over time, her expression tightened. She said nothing directly against the idea, but the way her gaze slid back to the walls, the way her fingers pressed together as if holding something in place, stayed with him long after the viewing ended. The transaction itself moved with unexpected speed. Evelyn did not counteroffer. When Marcus hesitated over the budget, she lowered the price without prompting, as though removing an obstacle she had anticipated. The paperwork revealed no hidden complications. The house was hers, free and clear. There were no liens, no disputes, no unfinished business on record. Everything about the sale suggested transparency, even generosity. And yet, when the keys finally changed hands weeks later, the moment felt weighted with something unsaid. Evelyn stood in the doorway, keys resting in her palm, her eyes moving once more toward the living room. She hesitated, as if measuring the distance between intention and action. Then, she placed the keys in Marcus's hand and stepped back. Her lips moved, forming words he could not fully catch, something that sounded like an apology carried on a breath. Before he could ask what she meant, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the house that was now, legally and officially, his. Marcus closed the door behind her and stood in the quiet that followed. The house did not feel triumphant or celebratory. It felt patient. He told himself that the unease was simply the weight of a major life change settling in, that every new beginning carried doubt. Still, his eyes drifted back to the living room wall, to the old wallpaper that seemed to hold its shape too well, as if it had been asked long ago to keep a secret. The thought passed, pushed aside by the practical demands of moving and planning. But it left behind a residue, a sense that the price he had paid for the house was not the full cost of owning it. That understanding, unformed but persistent, followed him as he began his first night in his new home, unaware that the wall he had already noticed would soon demand his attention in ways he could not yet imagine. Marcus returned to the house a second time with the quiet, deliberate focus of someone who no longer allowed first impressions to dictate his choices. The initial viewing had been about possibility, about the emotional weight of imagining a future that finally stayed put. This visit was meant to be practical, measured, detached. He brought with him the habits of his work, the instinct to verify, to look past surfaces and assess what lay beneath them. The door opened with the same soft resistance as before, wood settling into its frame as if the house needed to acknowledge him before letting him in. Inside, the air felt unchanged, still holding the faint, dry scent of dust and fabric that had not been disturbed in years. The silence was complete, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something held back, like a breath waiting to be released. Evelyn was already there, standing near the entryway as though she had not moved far from it since their last meeting. She greeted him politely, her voice calm but strained in a way Marcus could not quite define. It was not fear in the immediate sense. It was something slower, heavier, like the tension of a long-held decision. He began his inspection methodically. He checked the windows for drafts, the floors for soft spots, the ceilings for stains that might hint at leaks. He noted where the electrical outlets had been updated and where they had not, where pipes ran close to the surface and where they disappeared behind walls. The house revealed itself in fragments, none of them alarming on their own. Evelyn followed him, but not closely. She kept a careful distance, lingering in doorways, her presence more noticeable in the way she avoided certain spaces than in where she stood. Each time Marcus slowed his pace, each time he lingered over a detail, her posture shifted slightly, shoulders tightening, hands folding and unfolding in front of her. The living room drew them both back inevitably. It was the largest space in the house, the room that would define how the rest of it was used. Light spilled in through the front windows, illuminating the age of the walls rather than hiding it. The wallpaper absorbed the glow, and its muted vertical pattern softened by decades of sun. Marcus stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in the angles, the corners, the way the walls met the ceiling. The empty stretch of wallpaper on the far wall stood out more clearly now that he was looking for inconsistencies. It was not obvious in the way a patch or crack would be. It was obvious in its restraint. The pattern aligned too perfectly. The surface showed fewer signs of wear than the surrounding areas, as though it had been protected from the touch of furniture or hands. Evelyn's eyes never left that wall. She spoke again about the house's strength, about how well it had held up over time. She emphasized that it did not need improvements. The change often introduced problems where none had existed. The words themselves were reasonable. It was the urgency beneath them that unsettled Marcus. She did not say that renovations would be difficult or expensive. She said they were unnecessary, almost inappropriate. When Marcus mentioned that he might repaint, perhaps modernize certain rooms, he saw something pass across her face so quickly it could almost be dismissed. Almost. Her mouth tightened, and for a moment she seemed to struggle with a response that would not reveal too much. She repeated her earlier sentiment, this time with more emphasis. The house was fine as it was. It had served its purpose well. It deserved to be left alone. Marcus nodded, filing the reaction away without comment. Years of listening to people say one thing while meaning another had taught him the value of silence. He did not need her to explain herself in that moment. He needed only to observe. As they moved through the rest of the house, the pattern continued. Evelyn showed little interest in rooms that were already cluttered or visibly worn. Her attention sharpened only when Marcus approached walls that looked untouched. It was subtle, but once he noticed it, he could not ignore it. The transaction itself unfolded with an efficiency that felt almost rehearsed. Evelyn did not argue over terms. She did not ask for extra time or special accommodations. When Marcus expressed concern about the cost of inevitable repairs, she lowered the price without hesitation, her decision immediate and firm. The reduction was significant enough to ease his budget and sharp enough to raise his suspicion. It felt less like a negotiation and more like an offering. He reviewed the documents carefully, expecting to find some hidden complication that would justify the price and the urgency. There was none. The title was clean. The house had been in Evelyn's possession for decades, passed to her after the death of her husband, whose name appeared only briefly in the records. There were no outstanding debts tied to the property, no legal disputes waiting to surface. The simplicity of it all left Marcus uneasy in a way he could not articulate. In his experience, things rarely aligned so neatly without some cost deferred to the future. The day the keys were handed over, the house felt different. Evelyn arrived early, as though afraid of missing the moment. She stood just inside the doorway, the keys resting in her open palm. Marcus noticed how light they seemed, how little weight they carried compared to the significance of what they represented. She did not look around the house as one might expect someone to do when leaving a place for the last time. Her gaze fixed instead on the living room, on that same empty stretch of wall. The silence between them stretched, filled with something dense and unspoken. When she finally placed the keys in his hand, her fingers lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Her lips moved, forming words so softly that they barely disturbed the air. Marcus caught only the impression of regret, a shape of meaning rather than a sentence. Then she stepped back and turned away, her departure abrupt, as though staying even a moment longer would undo whatever resolve had carried her this far. Marcus watched her walk down the path, her figure diminishing until it merged with the quiet of the street. He closed the door and stood alone in the entryway, the keys cool and solid in his grip. Ownership settled over him, not as triumph, but as responsibility. As he moved through the house once more, now without Evelyn's presence to define its boundaries, he became acutely aware of how the space responded to him. The floors creaked more loudly. The air felt heavier in certain rooms. The living room, in particular, seemed to hold his attention, drawing his eyes back to the wall he had already begun to associate with unease. He told himself again that he was projecting meaning where none existed, that old houses carried quirks and old people carried attachments that did not need to be rational. He reminded himself of the practical advantages of the purchase, of the stability it promised. Still, as he stood in the living room that evening, the light fading and the wallpaper darkening with it, he felt the weight of an unspoken condition settle into place. He had bought the house. He had accepted the price. What he had not yet understood was the nature of the request that came with it, or how difficult it would soon become to honor it. The house did not greet Marcus with warmth when he moved in. It did not resist him either. It simply received him, absorbing his presence the way it absorbed sound, light, and dust, without comment or reaction. On his first night, he slept on a mattress placed directly on the floor of the bedroom, the rest of his belongings still packed into boxes stacked neatly along the walls. The room smelled faintly of old wood and something mineral, like stone that had been dry for a very long time. Every sound carried farther than he expected. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant rush of traffic several blocks away, the soft ticking of pipes cooling in the walls. It was not the comforting noise of a lived-in place, but the attentive quiet of a structure that had learned to listen. In the mornings, Marcus brewed coffee in the bare kitchen and drank it standing by the window, watching the street wake up. The neighborhood moved slowly. Elderly couples shuffled past with dogs on short leashes. A man down the block opened his garage at precisely the same time each day and stood inside it for several minutes without doing anything obvious, as if orienting himself to the world. A woman across the street swept her front steps every morning, though they never appeared dirty. There was routine here, but not the kind that invited participation. It was a choreography already established, into which Marcus had been quietly inserted. He began to learn the house through repetition. The third step on the staircase creaked no matter how lightly he stepped. The bathroom door swelled slightly in the humidity after a shower and needed to be nudged closed. One outlet in the living room worked only if the plug was angled just right. These details should have made the place feel familiar, even intimate, but instead they reinforced the sense that the house had an internal logic formed long before his arrival. The living room, in particular, resisted his attempts to make it his own. He moved boxes into it, then moved them out again, unable to decide where furniture should go. The space felt oddly balanced when left empty, as though it preferred not to be disturbed. His gaze returned again and again to the far wall with the old wallpaper. In different light, it revealed different subtleties. In the morning, the vertical pattern seemed almost cheerful, softened by sunlight. In the evening, shadows gathered unevenly along its surface, emphasizing the flatness of the expanse. Marcus told himself that he was overthinking it. This was the first home he had ever owned, and his mind was searching for significance where there was none. Still, he found himself avoiding placing anything against that wall. A bookshelf might fit there, he thought, a couch, but each time he imagined it, a vague resistance formed, not fear exactly, but hesitation. He began to explore the neighborhood more deliberately, taking walks after work, learning the rhythms of the street. The houses around him bore the marks of long habitation. Faded paint, repaired railings, small additions that spoke of changing needs over decades. Many of the residents were older, their faces lined with time and familiarity. They greeted him politely, but conversations rarely went beyond brief exchanges. There was curiosity in their eyes, sometimes calculation, but rarely warmth. Marcus noticed that when he mentioned having bought Evelyn's house, reactions shifted subtly. Smiles tightened. Responses grew shorter. A few people nodded and changed the subject. No one spoke ill of her, but no one spoke freely either. It was as though the house itself carried a reputation that people preferred not to examine too closely. One afternoon, Marcus visited the local library, drawn by a need to ground himself in something concrete. He searched for information about the neighborhood, paging through old newspapers and city records. The area had been built in the mid-20th century, primarily for working families. There were articles about factory expansions, school openings, church picnics, but scattered among them were darker fragments, reports of protests, police raids, references to subversive gatherings and unlawful assemblies. Names that appeared once and never again. Entire stories that seemed to stop mid-sentence, as if the ending had been deliberately erased. None of it pointed directly to his house. And yet, the more Marcus read, the more he sensed an absence that felt intentional. History had been curated here, trimmed of anything too sharp or unsettling. Back at the house, he began to notice details he had overlooked before. A section of baseboard in the living room that had been removed and reattached, its nails slightly newer than the surrounding wood. Faint scuff marks on the floor beneath the wallpapered wall, as if heavy objects had once been pressed there and then taken away. In the basement, behind shelves of old paint cans and gardening tools left behind by Evelyn, he found hooks embedded in the concrete wall, empty but positioned at deliberate intervals. Each discovery was small, easily explained on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that Marcus could not quite articulate. Despite the unease, he pressed forward with his plans. He needed to make the house livable, to transform it from a relic into a home. He ordered furniture, scheduled appointments with electricians and plumbers, made lists of repairs that would take months to complete. The living room, he decided, would be the first space he addressed properly. It was the heart of the house, the place that would define his relationship with it. The decision felt symbolic, though he did not fully acknowledge that at the time. On a Saturday morning, he gathered the tools he would need for the initial work: drop cloths, scrapers, a steamer for the wallpaper, protective gloves. He moved deliberately, almost ceremonially, preparing the space. The house watched in silence as he worked, its stillness unbroken. When he began peeling back the wallpaper, he was surprised by how easily it came away. The steam loosened the old adhesive, and the paper sagged and fell in heavy, damp sheets. Beneath it was another layer, and then another. Each one revealed a different pattern, a different shade, a different decade. Floral designs gave way to geometric shapes, which gave way to muted solids. It was like peeling back time itself, each layer preserving the aesthetic choices of a previous life. Marcus worked slowly, mindful of the age of the materials. The air grew thick with the smell of wet paper and old glue. His arms ached as the hours passed, but he felt a strange focus settle over him. This was tangible work, progress he could see and touch. It grounded him. By early afternoon, he reached the final layer. The wallpaper beneath it was thinner, more fragile. Its color faded almost to nothing. As he removed it, a difference in texture caught his eye. The plaster beneath was not uniform. There was a subtle but unmistakable outline in the shape of a rectangle, roughly the size of a small cabinet door, positioned at chest height. The surface inside the outline was smoother, its color slightly different from the surrounding wall. Marcus stepped back and stared at it, his heart beating faster for reasons he could not fully explain. He ran his hand over the area. The plaster felt cooler there, denser. When he tapped it with his knuckles, the sound that came back was wrong. It was hollow. He froze, the echo of the sound lingering in the room. For a long moment, he did nothing but stand there, his mind racing through possibilities. Old houses had quirks. Hidden compartments were not unheard of. Sometimes builders concealed shelves or access panels that were later covered over. It could be nothing. But as Marcus stood in the quiet living room, surrounded by the remnants of decades-old wallpaper, he felt the weight of Evelyn's request settle into place with sudden clarity. She had not asked him not to renovate out of nostalgia or stubbornness. She had been protecting something. The house had kept its silence for a long time. Now, standing before the hollow-sounding wall, Marcus understood that the silence was not empty at all. It was full, compressed, waiting for the moment when someone would finally listen closely enough to hear what lay behind it. And in that moment, with his hand still resting against the cool plaster, he knew that the choice he made next would change his relationship with the house forever. Marcus did not act immediately. The hollow sound lingered in the room long after his knuckles left the wall, vibrating not in the air but somewhere deeper, in the part of his mind that had learned to treat anomalies with caution. He stepped back, wiped his hands on his jeans, and forced himself to breathe normally. The living room looked unchanged, ordinary even, except for the bare plaster now exposed where the wallpaper had been. If he ignored the outline, if he chose not to see it, the house would allow that. It had already proven how well it could keep things hidden. He sat down on the floor, back against the opposite wall, and stared at the rectangle. From a distance, it seemed less threatening, almost mundane. A construction shortcut, perhaps, a sealed vent, an old access panel that had outlived its purpose. The rational explanations lined up easily, each one plausible enough to justify leaving it alone. He could patch the plaster, paint over it, and never think about it again. The house would be whole. His life would continue uninterrupted. But the memory of Evelyn's hands tightening as he spoke of renovation would not leave him. Nor would the speed with which he had lowered the price, as if removing obstacles mattered more than money. These recollections no longer felt like quirks of an eccentric seller. They felt like warnings delivered as gently as possible. Marcus stood again and examined the wall more closely. He measured the rectangle with a tape measure, noting its dimensions carefully. It was too precise to be accidental. He compared its position to the layout of the house, checking where beams and studs should have been. The outline did not align with any structural necessity. Whatever lay behind the plaster had been deliberately placed there, then deliberately concealed. He fetched a small flashlight and shone it across the surface at an angle. The light revealed subtle differences in texture, faint tool marks where newer plaster met older material. Someone had taken care to smooth the transition, to ensure that nothing would draw attention. This was not the work of a hurried repair. It was the work of someone who wanted the wall to forget what it held. The realization unsettled him more than the hollow sound itself. Marcus moved methodically, as he did in his professional life when confronted with situations that carried potential consequences. He checked the electrical layout again, tracing wires from outlets and switches to ensure none ran through the area. He reviewed old building plans he had found online, cross-referencing them with what he could see. There were no indications of hidden utilities, no reason for a sealed cavity of this size. As he worked, the house remained quiet, the silence now feeling less neutral and more attentive. Every scrape of his tools against the floor sounded louder than before. The light shifted as afternoon gave way to early evening, shadows stretching across the living room and gathering along the edges of the exposed plaster. When he finally picked up the hammer, it was not with excitement or fear, but with a sense of reluctant acceptance. He understood, at last, that the decision had already been made the moment he recognized the outline for what it was. Leaving it unopened would not restore peace. It would only postpone the unease, allowing it to settle into the walls alongside whatever had been hidden there. He positioned the hammer carefully and tapped at the edge of the rectangle, testing the resistance. The plaster was thick, denser than he had expected. It crumbled under pressure, but did not give way easily, as if reinforced. He adjusted his angle and tried again, applying slightly more force. This time a small crack formed, radiating outward in a jagged line. The sound was sharper now, echoing faintly through the house. Marcus paused, listening. Nothing responded. No shift in the walls, no creak of protest. Encouraged, he continued, working slowly around the perimeter. Each strike loosened more plaster, revealing a layer beneath that was unmistakably different in color and composition. This was not original to the house. Someone had added it later intentionally to seal something away. As fragments fell to the floor, a new texture emerged beneath them. Brick. The sight of it sent a chill through him. The cavity had not simply been covered. It had been bricked up, sealed with care and effort. Whoever had done this had not intended for it to be reopened easily. This was no forgotten shelf or abandoned vent. This was a barrier. Marcus set the hammer down and leaned closer, brushing dust from the exposed brick with his fingers. The mortar was old but intact, its edges smoothed carefully. He recognized the craftsmanship, the deliberate neatness that spoke of time and intention rather than haste. For a moment, doubt returned. Breaking through brick would escalate the act from curiosity to intrusion. It would mark a clear point of no return. He considered the possibility that whatever lay behind it had been sealed for a reason that still applied. That disturbing it could bring consequences he could not foresee. The thought of weapons crossed his mind briefly, then faded. The arrangement felt wrong for that. There was no sign of reinforcement for weight or shock, no metal framework. The cavity seemed designed not to restrain something dangerous, but to protect something fragile. That idea steadied him. He retrieved a chisel and positioned it carefully between two bricks near the top of the rectangle, where gravity would be less likely to cause damage to whatever lay behind. He struck the chisel with measured force, loosening the mortar bit by bit. The work was slow, physically demanding, and strangely intimate. Each brick he removed felt like a violation of someone else's careful planning. Sweat ran down his back as the opening widened. The air around the wall grew stale, carrying a faint scent that reminded him of old books and basements. When he finally removed a brick large enough to peer through, he hesitated, then leaned forward. The beam of his flashlight cut into the darkness beyond the wall, illuminating shapes that his mind struggled to interpret at first. It was not an empty space, nor was it chaotic. Inside the cavity, stacked with precision, were dozens of tightly wrapped bundles. They were arranged in rows, each one similar in size and shape, as if catalogued rather than hidden. Marcus stared, his breath caught somewhere between relief and shock. His first instinct was disbelief. This was not what he had prepared himself to find. The orderliness of it all contradicted the fear that had been building in him. Whatever this was, it had been cared for. He widened the opening just enough to reach inside, his movements cautious, almost reverent. The space was deeper than he had expected, extending several feet into the wall. He touched one of the bundles lightly. It was wrapped in layers of paper and fabric, secured with string that had yellowed with age. The weight of it surprised him. He drew it out carefully and set it on the floor, the dust it released drifting upward in a thin cloud. The living room felt smaller now, as though the house itself were leaning in to watch. Marcus did not open the bundle right away. He sat back on his heels and looked from the opening in the wall to the object resting on the floor. The implications pressed in on him from all sides. This was not a single forgotten item. It was part of a system, a collection. He thought again of Evelyn, of her careful avoidance, her unspoken urgency, of the neighborhood's guarded silence, of the articles he had read about gatherings that disappeared from the record. The fragments of unease he had collected over the past weeks aligned suddenly, forming a pattern that pointed inward, toward the hollow wall and the secret it had guarded for so long. As evening settled fully outside, the living room darkened around him. Marcus turned on a lamp, its light casting long shadows across the floor and the exposed bricks. He understood now that the house's silence had not been emptiness. It had been containment. He reached for the bundle, fingers closing around the brittle wrapping. Whatever lay inside had waited a long time to be seen. And now that it had begun, there was no turning back. Marcus opened the first bundle slowly, as though speed might somehow damage what had been protected for so long. The paper crinkled under his fingers, dry and fragile, releasing a sharper scent of age as it unfolded. Inside was not what his imagination, fueled by weeks of tension, had prepared him for. There was no metal, no object of obvious value, no immediate threat. Instead, there were documents. Stacks of paper folded carefully, edges aligned, wrapped again in a thin cloth that had once been white. He lifted the top sheet and felt his pulse slow, then quicken again in a different way. The paper was old but intact, its surface softened by time. Typed text alternated with handwritten notes and dark, deliberate ink. Dates appeared in the margins, names repeated across pages. This was not a random collection. It was an archive. Marcus set the papers aside with care and reached back into the cavity, removing more bundles one by one. He laid them out across the living room floor, creating a growing field of objects that transformed the space entirely. Where hours earlier there had been bare plaster and dust, there was now a quiet order emerging, as if the room itself were revealing a second, hidden function it had once served. Some bundles contained photographs. Black and white prints, many of them small, their edges worn smooth by handling. Faces stared back at him from another era. Families gathered around kitchen tables. Groups of men and women standing close together in basements or living rooms, their expressions serious, sometimes defiant, sometimes cautious. In several images, Marcus recognized the features of his own neighborhood. The outlines of houses, familiar porches, street corners that still existed just outside his front door. The realization sent a chill through him. These people had stood where he now stood. Their lives had intersected with this place in ways that had never been recorded publicly. Other bundles held newspaper clippings carefully folded and grouped. Headlines leapt out at him, heavy with the language of suspicion and accusation. Words like investigation, radical, subversive, unlawful appeared again and again. Some articles had entire sections underlined or circled in red pencil. Others had handwritten notes scrawled in the margins, comments that corrected or challenged the narratives presented in print. The clippings spanned decades, forming a timeline of tension that Marcus had only glimpsed before in his research. There were letters as well, dozens of them, tied together with string or ribbon, their envelopes thin and discolored. Many lacked return addresses. Some were unsigned. Marcus hesitated before opening these, aware that letters carried a more intimate weight than official documents. When he finally did, he found pages filled with tightly written text, the handwriting varying from neat and controlled to rushed and uneven. These were not casual correspondences. They spoke of fear, of urgency, of trust placed in unseen hands, requests for help, updates on situations that could not be discussed openly, gratitude expressed in cautious language, as if even the act of writing thanks carried risk. As he continued to unpack the bundles, a pattern emerged. The materials were grouped by year, sometimes by location. Small notes attached to certain stacks identified names or events, anchoring the archive in time. Whoever had assembled this collection had understood its importance. This was not hoarding. It was preservation. Marcus worked for hours, forgetting hunger and fatigue. He spread a clean sheet across the floor and began arranging the contents more deliberately, separating photographs from documents, letters from clippings. The living room transformed into a makeshift research space, the air filled with the quiet intensity of discovery. Each item added another layer to the story forming in his mind. Then he noticed something that did not fit. At the back of the cavity, set apart from the rest, were several bundles wrapped differently from the others. Instead of yellowed paper or cloth, these were encased in a silvery, reflective material that caught the light of his lamp and threw it back in sharp flashes. The material was smooth and intact, far less aged than everything else he had uncovered. The contrast was striking, almost jarring. Marcus retrieved one of these strange packages and held it up, turning it slowly in his hands. It felt lighter than he expected, its surface cool and unfamiliar. There were no markings, no labels, nothing to indicate its contents. The fact that it had been placed alongside materials dating back decades suggested intention rather than coincidence. He opened it with even greater care than before. Inside were strips of film, tightly wound and secured, their surfaces dark and glossy. Marcus recognized them after a moment as photographic negatives or microfilm, preserved in a way designed to protect them from light and moisture. His breath caught as he realized what this implied. Someone had not only hidden original documents here, someone had returned later with more modern materials to create copies, to ensure that even if the originals were destroyed, the information would survive. The implications of that decision were profound. It meant the fear that had necessitated the archive had not ended when the earliest documents were written. It had persisted. It had evolved. Marcus sat back on his heels, surrounded by evidence of lives lived in secrecy, of history deliberately kept out of sight. The house felt different now, less like a shelter and more like a witness. Its walls had not merely contained these objects, they had protected them, absorbing decades of silence to preserve what lay within. He returned to the photographs, studying them more closely. In several, he noticed a woman who appeared repeatedly, younger in some images, older in others. Her face was familiar. Evelyn. She stood among the groups not as an observer, but as a participant, her presence woven into the gatherings documented here. In one photograph, she stood beside a group of black men and women on the front steps of a house Marcus now recognized unmistakably as his own. The angle was different, the details slightly altered by time, but there was no doubt. This house had been a meeting place, a refuge. The realization reframed everything he had learned about her. Her urgency, her fear, her refusal to let go of the past even as she sold the house. She had not been protecting a structure. She had been protecting a story. As the night wore on, Marcus began to understand the scope of what he had found. This was not a single family's secret. It was a network, a hidden infrastructure of support and resistance that had operated quietly in the shadows of official history. The documents spoke of legal aid offered discreetly, of families sheltered during times of threat, of meetings held in basements and living rooms when public spaces were unsafe. Names crossed racial and social lines, bound together by shared risk. Marcus felt a growing weight settle in his chest. With this discovery came responsibility. These were not objects he could simply store away or ignore. They carried consequences, both for the past they documented and the present they now occupied. Mishandling them could erase what had survived against all odds. He glanced toward the opening in the wall, the bricks stacked neatly beside it, and imagined the decades during which this archive had remained untouched. How many times had Evelyn stood in this room, aware of what lay hidden inches from her hand? How many times had she chosen silence over safety, secrecy over relief? By the time Marcus finally stood and stretched, his body stiff from hours on the floor, the living room was unrecognizable. It had become a bridge between eras, a place where suppressed history had surfaced into light. He looked around at the scattered papers, the photographs watching silently, the reflective packages gleaming faintly. Outside, the street had grown quiet. The routines of the neighborhood had settled into sleep, unaware of the reckoning unfolding behind one unassuming wall. Marcus understood now that he was no longer simply a homeowner uncovering a curiosity. He was the latest custodian of a truth that had been deliberately buried. And as he gathered the materials carefully, preparing to protect them until he could decide what to do next, he felt the full gravity of that role press down on him. The house had given up its secret. What Marcus chose to do with it would determine whether the silence that had preserved it for so long would finally be broken. The days that followed blurred into one another, marked not by the usual rhythms of work and rest, but by the quiet, consuming pull of what lay spread across the living room floor. Marcus continued going to his job, continued answering calls and filling out reports, but his attention felt divided, as if part of him remained behind in the house even when he was physically elsewhere. The archive had rearranged his sense of time. The present felt thinner, less substantial than the layers of past he now carried with him. Each evening, he returned home and resumed his careful work. He bought archival boxes and acid-free folders, guided by instinct and a basic understanding of how fragile these materials were. He did not yet trust himself to involve anyone else. For now, the responsibility was his alone. He handled each document with the same care he would have given to a living person, aware that a careless fold or a drop of moisture could erase something that had survived decades of deliberate concealment. As he sorted, patterns emerged with increasing clarity. Dates repeated. Names resurfaced across different formats and years, linking photographs to letters, letters to legal documents to news articles that only half told their stories. He began keeping a notebook beside him, jotting down connections, timelines, questions that demanded answers. The living room became a quiet laboratory of reconstruction, the house itself serving as both subject and witness. The earliest materials dated back to the late 1940s. Photographs from that period showed gatherings that were small and cautious, often staged in private spaces. People stood close together, their proximity suggesting both solidarity and the necessity of secrecy. In many images, windows were covered, curtains drawn even during the day. Faces carried an alertness that Marcus recognized instantly. He had seen that same look in his clients when they spoke about threats that had never been recorded, fears that could not be proven, but shaped every decision. The letters from those years were especially careful in their language. Writers avoided specifics, relying on shared understanding rather than explicit detail. Meetings were referred to obliquely. Help was requested in coded terms. Yet, beneath the caution, urgency pulsed. These were people living with the constant awareness that their words, if intercepted, could be turned against them. As the timeline progressed into the 1950s, the tone shifted. The documents grew heavier, the language more defensive. Newspaper clippings from that era spoke openly of investigations and loyalty tests, of neighbors reporting neighbors, of communities fractured by suspicion. Marcus recognized the era immediately, even before confirming the dates. This was the height of the Red Scare, when ideology itself became grounds for persecution and association could be as dangerous as action. The archive documented the local consequences of that national fear. Lists of names appeared alongside notes indicating who had been questioned, who had lost jobs, who had disappeared from public life entirely. Some names were crossed out, others were followed by a single word written in a careful hand: gone. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest each time he encountered one of those notations. Gone could mean many things: relocation, incarceration, death. The archive did not always specify. Silence filled in the gaps where truth had been too dangerous to record. What struck him most was how interconnected everything was. Addresses repeated across documents, many of them within a few blocks of his own house. The network had been local, rooted deeply in the neighborhood. This was not an abstract movement or a distant struggle. It had unfolded on these streets behind these doors, in rooms that now housed quiet retirees and families unaware of the history beneath their feet. The photographs confirmed this intimacy. Marcus found images of familiar landmarks taken decades earlier, their surroundings changed but recognizable. A corner store that now sold coffee and pastries appeared in one photograph as a meeting point, its windows darkened. A church he passed on his walks had once been watched closely, its members listed in an anonymous report clipped from a newspaper. The neighborhood itself seemed to rise from the archive, revealing a version of itself that had been carefully buried under years of normalcy. At the center of many documents was a name that appeared with increasing frequency as the years advanced. It belonged to a man who seemed to function as a bridge between worlds. He was referenced in legal correspondence, in personal letters, in notes that hinted at strategy and support. He was described as someone who could be trusted, someone who knew how to navigate systems designed to exclude and punish. His profession shifted depending on the source. Lawyer, advocate, organizer, sometimes simply friend. Marcus felt a sense of recognition that had nothing to do with familiarity. He understood this role instinctively. It mirrored his own work in ways that unsettled him. The responsibility of standing between vulnerable people and powerful institutions had not changed as much as he had believed. Only the language had evolved. The silver-wrapped bundles continued to trouble him. When he finally worked up the courage to examine them more closely, he did so with deliberate care. He borrowed a light table from a colleague under the pretense of a personal project and used it to view the film strips. Images emerged slowly, reversed and shadowed, but unmistakable. They were copies of documents he had already handled, along with others he had not yet seen in their original form. Some were records that had clearly been destroyed or altered elsewhere. Official forms with signatures that appeared in no public archive. Photographs of meetings that had never been reported. Lists that extended beyond the years covered by the paper documents. The microfilm bridged gaps, confirming that the archive had been updated long after its initial creation. This realization forced Marcus to reconsider the timeline. Evelyn had not simply sealed the wall and walked away. She, or someone acting with her knowledge, had returned to it years later. The fear had not ended with the easing of political pressure or the passing of specific laws. It had lingered, passed down, internalized. The act of copying and preserving suggested a long-term strategy, a belief that truth might need to wait decades before it could safely surface. Marcus began researching the names he encountered, cross-referencing them with public records, obituaries, and historical databases. Some yielded results. Others vanished entirely, existing only within the archive. He discovered cases where individuals officially listed as having moved out of state had, in fact, been arrested. In other instances, people labeled as agitators had later been quietly exonerated, their records corrected long after the damage had been done. The emotional toll of this work crept up on him. He dreamed of faces from the photographs, of rooms crowded with people whispering plans and fears. He woke with the sensation of being watched, not by the house, but by the past pressing close, eager not to be forgotten again. The silence that had once felt merely heavy now felt charged, filled with the weight of expectation. At times, Marcus questioned his right to know any of this. He was an outsider in the sense that these events had occurred before his birth, shaped by forces he had studied but not lived through. And yet, the archive itself seemed to answer that doubt. It had been hidden not to remain buried forever, but to endure. Someone had believed that there would come a time when the risk of revelation would finally be worth taking. That belief now rested squarely on his shoulders. He reached a point where he could no longer pretend that this was a private matter. The volume of material, the implications of what it documented, demanded expertise beyond his own. Preservation alone would not be enough. The stories encoded here needed to be contextualized, verified, protected from misinterpretation or exploitation. At the same time, he feared the consequences of exposure. Some names might still belong to living people. Some wounds might reopen violently. The choice before him felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability. The archive had already altered his understanding of the house, the neighborhood, and himself. Keeping it hidden would not restore the balance he had disturbed. It would only deepen the isolation of the past, repeating the very erasure the archive resisted. One evening, as he sat amid neatly stacked boxes, the light from the lamp reflecting off the silver-wrapped film, Marcus realized that the house no longer felt like a place of concealment. It had become a threshold, a point of transition between silence and speech, between fear and acknowledgement. He closed his notebook and looked toward the bricked opening in the wall, still partially exposed, its rough edges a reminder of what had been done to protect what mattered. The history that had been hidden here was not asking for secrecy anymore. It was asking for care, for courage, and for a willingness to let it breathe in the open air. And with that understanding came the certainty that he could not move forward alone. Marcus began looking for Evelyn with a persistence that surprised even him. It was not driven by suspicion in the conventional sense, nor by any expectation that she might provide answers neatly packaged in words. It was driven by the growing awareness that she was no longer simply a former homeowner. She was a living link, perhaps the last one, to a story that had been deliberately fractured and buried. Understanding the archive without understanding her felt incomplete, like reading correspondence without knowing who had chosen which letters to keep and which to destroy. His first attempts were simple. He called the number she had provided during the sale. It rang once, then went dead. He tried again the next evening, then a third time days later. The line remained disconnected. He searched public records, hoping to find a forwarding address or a trace of relocation. There was nothing recent. Evelyn's presence seemed to dissolve at the precise moment she handed over the keys, as if the act of selling the house had also released her from the visible world. Marcus turned to the neighborhood. He approached carefully, mindful of how guarded the area had already proven to be. He began with casual questions, framed as the curiosity of a new homeowner settling in. Had anyone known Evelyn well? Did anyone know where she had gone? The responses were polite but evasive. People spoke of her in generalities, their words rounded smooth by time and distance. She had lived here a long time. She had kept to herself. She was quiet. She had no close family nearby. Whenever Marcus pressed gently for more detail, conversations shifted. Someone would remember an appointment they needed to keep, or comment on the weather, or ask about his work instead. It was not hostility he encountered, but reluctance, the kind that comes from long practice. The silence itself became a form of confirmation. It was only after several days of walking the same routes, of exchanging greetings that grew incrementally warmer, that one neighbor finally lingered long enough to speak. She was an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, her posture bent by age, but her eyes sharp with attention. Marcus had seen her before, always seated near her front window, watching the street with the patience of someone who understood that observation was its own form of participation. She did not invite him inside. Instead, she spoke to him from her porch, her voice low but steady. She did not answer his questions directly. Instead, she offered fragments, as if testing whether he knew how to listen. She spoke of Evelyn as someone who had not always been alone, of a husband who had once been a visible presence in the neighborhood, a man who dressed neatly and spoke carefully, who seemed to know how to navigate institutions without provoking them. She mentioned his work only obliquely, referring to cases and meetings, without specifying their nature. She spoke of a time when unfamiliar cars had begun appearing on the street, parking for hours at a time, of curtains drawn not for privacy, but for protection. According to her, the husband's disappearance had not been dramatic. There had been no police tape, no public spectacle. One day, he simply stopped appearing. People were told he had left town. Later, they were told he had fallen ill. Eventually, they were told nothing at all. The absence settled into place like a fact no one was expected to examine too closely. Evelyn, she said, had changed after that. She had become quieter, more careful. She stopped attending gatherings. She spoke less, observed more. She remained in the house even as others moved away, as if leaving it were not an option she could consider. The woman paused at that point, studying Marcus's face with renewed intensity. "You don't tear up roots that deep," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus did not press her further. He thanked her and walked back toward his house, the weight of her words settling slowly over him. The image that formed in his mind was no longer abstract. It was intimate and deeply human. A woman bound to a place not by nostalgia, but by obligation and fear. That evening, Marcus returned to the archive with a new lens through which to view it. He searched for references to Evelyn's husband, guided now by a name the neighbor had mentioned in passing. It did not take long to find him. His name appeared in legal documents, in correspondence marked confidential, in handwritten notes that praised his discretion and reliability. He had been, by all accounts, a man who understood the risks of visibility. The more Marcus read, the clearer the picture became. Evelyn's husband had served as a quiet intermediary, using his professional position to shield others where possible, to delay or redirect attention, to provide guidance that never appeared in official transcripts. His name rarely appeared in headlines, but it surfaced repeatedly in the margins, in acknowledgments written in careful code. Then the references stopped. The documents did not record his disappearance explicitly. There were no letters mourning him, no notes marking his absence. Instead, there was a subtle shift in tone. Communications became more fragmented. Certain names vanished from lists. The archive did not explain what had happened to him, but it bore the imprint of loss in its structure. Something essential had been removed. Marcus found a photograph late that night that he had not examined closely before. It showed a small group standing on the front steps of the house. The image was faded, the edges curled with age. Evelyn stood near the center, younger but unmistakable, her posture tense but resolute. Beside her was a man whose expression was both calm and alert. His arm rested lightly at her back, a gesture of reassurance that now felt unbearably poignant. On the back of the photograph, written in careful, deliberate handwriting, were a date and a short phrase: "Safe house." Marcus sat with the photograph for a long time, the house around him quiet and attentive. The meaning of Evelyn's behavior during the sale finally resolved into focus. Her insistence that he not change the walls had not been superstition or stubbornness. It had been fear, sharpened by decades of conditioning. To alter the house was to risk exposure, even long after the danger had ostensibly passed. Trauma, Marcus knew, did not obey timelines. Her urgency to sell made sense now as well. She had reached an age where the future was uncertain. The archive could not remain hidden indefinitely without someone to guard it. Yet, revealing it herself would have required confronting everything she had spent her life avoiding. Selling the house was her compromise, a way to transfer responsibility without naming it. Marcus considered why she might have chosen him. He could not claim certainty, but the possibility unsettled him nonetheless. Perhaps she had recognized in him a familiarity, a quiet diligence shaped by work that demanded discretion and empathy. Perhaps she believed he would see the value in what she had protected, rather than dismiss it as a curiosity or exploit it for gain. Or perhaps she had simply reached a point where choice no longer mattered, where fate could be trusted to intervene. He never learned where Evelyn went after leaving the house. The records remained silent. The neighbors offered no further details. It was as if she had stepped out of the narrative at the precise moment her role was complete. Marcus found himself hoping, irrationally, that she had found some measure of peace, that relinquishing the house had lightened a burden she had carried for most of her life. As he closed the archive boxes that night, Marcus felt a shift within himself. The story was no longer just about history, or even justice. It was about inheritance in the deepest sense. Evelyn had inherited fear, responsibility, and silence. She had preserved them as best she could at great personal cost. Now, by an act that appeared ordinary on the surface, she had passed them on. Marcus stood in the living room and looked once more at the exposed section of wall, the bricks visible beneath the plaster. He understood now that the house had never been merely a shelter. It had been an instrument. A place designed not only to protect bodies, but to safeguard truths that could not survive in the open. The finality of that understanding settled over him with quiet force. Whatever remained to be done, whatever consequences lay ahead, he knew that Evelyn's story and the archive's story were inseparable. To honor one, he would have to honor the other. And that meant ensuring that what had been hidden for so long would not disappear again into silence. Marcus waited longer than he had intended before taking the final step. Not out of doubt, but out of respect. The archive had survived because it had been handled slowly, thoughtfully, always with an awareness of consequences. Rushing now would feel like a betrayal of the care that had preserved it through decades of danger and silence. He spent several more days ensuring that every document, every photograph, every strip of film was protected as well as he could manage on his own. The living room, once bare and undecided, now resembled a temporary sanctuary, its purpose transformed yet again. When he finally reached out beyond himself, he did so carefully. He contacted a university archive known for its work on civil rights history, choosing it not for prestige but for discretion. He did not describe everything at once. He spoke in measured terms, outlining the existence of a private collection, its age, its sensitivity. The response was immediate but restrained, professional in tone yet unmistakably alert. Arrangements were made without fanfare. No announcements, no publicity, just a date, a time, and a request that nothing be altered further. The morning they arrived, the house felt different. Not anxious, not resistant, but alert in a way Marcus had come to recognize. Two archivists entered quietly, their movements deliberate, their voices kept low even though no one else was present. They wore gloves, carried acid-free boxes, and approached the materials with a reverence that eased the tightness in Marcus's chest. He watched as they examined the documents, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition to something deeper and more solemn. They did not need him to explain much. The archive spoke for itself. As the materials were cataloged and carefully packed, confirmations began to emerge. Names Marcus had flagged matched records long thought incomplete. Dates aligned with gaps in official histories. One archivist paused over a photograph, her fingers hovering just above the paper, and closed her eyes briefly before moving on. Another spent a long time studying the microfilm, his face tightening as images appeared on the light table. What Marcus had found was not merely rare, it was foundational. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly but steadily. Historians cross-referenced names with court records and employment files. Families were contacted, cautiously, respectfully. Some learned for the first time what had happened to relatives whose lives had ended in ambiguity. Others received confirmation of suspicions they had carried for decades without proof. The archive did not erase pain, but it reshaped it, giving it boundaries and meaning. Marcus remained at a careful distance from the public outcomes. He declined interviews. He redirected inquiries to the archivists and researchers who could contextualize the findings properly. He did not want the story simplified or sensationalized. This was not a mystery solved for entertainment. It was a history restored because it had finally become safe enough to be seen. The house, meanwhile, waited. Once the archive was gone, the living room felt unexpectedly large. The absence of the documents left behind a silence that was different from the one that had preceded their discovery. It was lighter, less compressed, as though the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for generations. Marcus began the work of repair in earnest then, repainting walls, refinishing floors, replacing fixtures that had long outlived their usefulness. He did not, however, restore the wall completely. The bricks remained visible, framed neatly rather than concealed. He chose not to plaster over them, not to erase the evidence of what had been done there. The exposed section became a deliberate scar, a reminder embedded into the architecture of the house. Visitors sometimes asked about it. Marcus offered only a simple explanation. The house had a history. This was part of it. In the bedroom, he hung a single photograph he had kept with the archivist's blessing. It showed the front steps of the house decades earlier, a small group gathered close together. At the center stood a young Evelyn, her posture tense but determined, beside her husband, his hand resting lightly against her back. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, were the words he had come to know by heart: "Safe house." Living in the house changed Marcus in ways he had not anticipated. Stability came, but not in the form he had originally imagined. It was not simply the absence of movement or the comfort of ownership. It was a deeper grounding, an understanding that permanence was not about walls remaining unchanged, but about truth being carried forward intact. He found himself more attentive to the quiet histories around him. The way neighbors spoke, or did not speak, about the past. The subtle markers of survival embedded in ordinary places. He understood now that safety was often provisional, negotiated daily by people whose names never appeared in textbooks. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus stood in the living room and rested his hand against the exposed brick. It was cool beneath his palm, solid and unyielding. He thought of Evelyn then, of the life she had lived in proximity to danger, of the strength it had taken to protect something she could not openly acknowledge. He hoped, without evidence, that she had found peace somewhere beyond the boundaries of the neighborhood. The house no longer felt like it was watching him. It felt, instead, like a partner in remembrance. Its walls had held fear, courage, secrecy, and care. Now they held light, furniture, the ordinary sounds of a life continuing forward. But the past was not erased. It was integrated, allowed to exist without dominating the present. Marcus understood, finally, that this had been the true inheritance Evelyn had left behind. Not just a house, and not even the archive itself, but a responsibility to remember without being consumed by what was remembered. The wall remained, not as a warning, but as a testament to the lives it had protected, to the silence that had kept them alive, and to the moment when silence was no longer the safest choice. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. There are more real stories ahead, even stranger, even deeper, and just as unforgettable. Watch the next video, explore other stories on the channel, and share this video with someone who loves hidden history and unexpected discoveries.